fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song above Terminal 4 at John F. Kennedy International Airport. It was 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in July 2021, and the sprawling complex had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The last red-eye passengers had shuffled through security hours ago, leaving behind only the skeleton crew of night workers who kept America's busiest airport functioning in the darkness. Waxed floors stretched endlessly under the harsh lighting, gleaming like black mirrors that reflected the occasional TSA agent walking his rounds. The terminal felt cathedral-like in its emptiness, vast, echoing, and somehow sacred in its solitude. Gate monitors flickered with tomorrow's departures, while cleaning carts rolled silently across the polished marble. The air conditioning system cycled through its programmed intervals, creating brief gusts that rustled forgotten newspapers and stirred the artificial plants positioned throughout the concourse. Among the uniformed figures moving through this late-night landscape was Luis Ortega, a 46-year-old janitor from Queens who had become as much a fixture of JFK's night shift as the security cameras themselves. He pushed his industrial mop bucket with the practiced efficiency of someone who had traced these same paths for over a decade. His movements so routine, they barely registered on the consciousness of guards, maintenance workers, or the few overnight travelers catching red-eye connections. Luis wore the standard-issue navy blue uniform of Atlantic Cleaning Services, his name badge slightly faded from years of washing. At 5'7", with graying temples and the lean build of a man who walked miles every night, he possessed the ultimate superpower in modern America. He was completely invisible. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent years working while others slept, the permanent slight squint of fluorescent lighting, and the careful expression of a man who had learned that anonymity was survival. The ritual of his nightly routine had become meditation. Start with Terminal 4's international arrivals, work systematically through customs areas, then move to the restricted corridors where diplomatic cargo waited for processing. Each area had its own rhythm, its own cast of overnight characters. The TSA agents who nodded politely as he passed, the customs officials who barely acknowledged his presence, the occasional federal air marshal grabbing coffee from the 24-hour kiosk near Gate 23. He was just another uniform in the background, FBI Special Agent Maria Santos would later tell reporters, until $17 million vanished without a trace. But on this particular night, as Luis methodically cleaned the restricted corridors near the international cargo bays, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He simply moved his mop into figure-8 patterns, the same motion he'd performed roughly 30,000 times since starting at JFK in 2010, unaware that fate was about to transform an invisible janitor into one of the most wanted men in America. The cargo area held its own mysterious energy during overnight hours. Massive containers from around the world sat in organized rows, their contents representing the global economy in its most tangible form. Electronics from South Korea, textiles from Bangladesh, automotive parts from Germany, coffee from Colombia. Luis had learned to read the shipping codes, understanding which containers held routine commerce and which carried more sensitive materials requiring special handling. Tonight felt different, though Luis couldn't immediately identify why. Perhaps it was the unusual number of security contractors moving through restricted areas, or the subtle tension he sensed among the customs officials processing late arrivals. After 11 years of night shifts, Luis had developed an almost supernatural awareness of atmospheric changes in the airport's ecosystem. Something was stirring beneath the surface of routine operations. As he approached the cargo bay designated for diplomatic shipments, Luis noticed increased activity around a particular container marked with Colombian shipping codes. 3 men in contractor uniforms were examining paperwork while engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Their body language suggested urgency, maybe concern. Luis adjusted his cleaning route to pass closer to their location, his curiosity piqued by this deviation from normal patterns. The container itself looked unremarkable, steel gray, approximately 8 feet long, bearing the standard diplomatic seals that granted it expedited customs processing. But something about the way the contractors handled it suggested contents far more valuable than typical government correspondence or cultural exchange materials. They moved with the careful precision of people transporting something irreplaceable, something that couldn't be damaged or lost. Luis Ortega's personnel file at Atlantic Cleaning Services told the story of the perfect employee. 11 years of unblemished service. Never late, never complained, never called in sick. His supervisor, Marcus Rodriguez, would describe him to federal investigators as the guy you never worried about. The file contained commendations for reliability, efficiency, and what one evaluation described as exceptional situational awareness for a maintenance worker. Luis was solid, Rodriguez explained during his FBI interview months later. Showed up, did his work, went home. In this business, that's gold. You got guys calling in with hangovers, guys who steal supplies, guys who cause drama with security. Luis, 11 years. And I never had one complaint. Never had to write him up. Never had to question his judgment. He was like the perfect employee, invisible until you needed him. But Rodriguez's assessment only scratched the surface of who Luis Ortega really was. Behind the quiet demeanor and reliable work habits lived a man whose intelligence had been consistently underestimated throughout his adult life. Luis possessed what psychologists call crystallized intelligence, the ability to accumulate, retain, and apply vast amounts of practical knowledge over time. His memory was nearly photographic, particularly for spatial relationships and procedural details. He could walk through JFK blindfolded and navigate perfectly using only his mental map of the facility. The divorce papers had been finalized in 2018, marking the end of a 15-year marriage that had gradually eroded under the weight of Luis's unconventional schedule and what Maria Elena called his emotional unavailability. The truth was more complex. Luis had learned early in life that survival required emotional distance, careful observation, and the ability to fade into backgrounds when necessary. These traits made him an excellent airport employee, but a challenging husband and father. He was always watching, Maria Elena would tell FBI agents during their investigation. Not in a creepy way, just observing. Like he was always taking mental notes about everything around him. At dinner, he'd notice if I'd rearranged furniture or bought new curtains before I even mentioned it. He remembered conversations from months ago, word for word. It was like living with someone who was constantly studying the world. His two children, Sophia, now 16, and Miguel, 14, had inherited their father's intelligence but struggled with his emotional distance. Luis loved them deeply but expressed affection through practical gestures rather than emotional connection. He helped with homework by teaching efficient study methods, fixed their bicycles with professional precision, and could recall every conversation about their hopes and concerns. But he rarely initiated physical affection or shared his own feelings about their lives and futures. At $16.75 per hour, Luis earned just over $30,000 annually, barely enough to cover child support, his studio apartment in Elmhurst, and basic living expenses. The financial pressure was constant but manageable through careful budgeting and elimination of all non-essential expenditures. Luis had learned to live like a monk, minimal possessions, simple meals, entertainment limited to library books, and occasional coffee at the diner near his apartment. His colleagues knew him as quiet but not unfriendly, someone who spent lunch breaks reading paperback thrillers, usually crime novels featuring elaborate heists and clever criminals who outwitted sophisticated security systems. Luis gravitated towards stories involving meticulous planning, patient execution, and protagonists who succeeded through intelligence rather than violence. He particularly enjoyed novels where ordinary people discovered hidden talents for criminal enterprise when circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. He loved those books, remembered fellow janitor Carmen Vasquez, a heavy-set woman from the Bronx who had worked alongside Luis for 6 years, always reading about guys pulling off impossible jobs, bank heists, casino robberies, art thefts. We used to joke that he was studying for some kind of criminal exam. He'd get so absorbed in those stories that he'd barely talk during breaks, just reading and taking notes in that little notebook he always carried. The notebook was a worn composition book with a black and white marble cover, the kind elementary school students use for writing assignments. Luis filled page after page with observations, thoughts, and what appeared to be random information about airport operations. To casual observers, it looked like the harmless hobby of someone with too much time on his hands. In reality, Luis was unconsciously preparing for the most significant moment of his life. If only his co-workers had known how prophetic their jokes about criminal studies would prove to be. Luis had grown up in the same Queens neighborhood where he now lived alone. The son of Colombian immigrants who had arrived in New York in the 1970s with nothing but determination and willingness to work harder than anyone around them. His father, Roberto, had found employment in construction until a fall from scaffolding ended his career and left him permanently disabled. His mother, Esperanza, cleaned offices in Manhattan until arthritis in her hands forced early retirement. They had taught Luis the value of honest work, the importance of staying invisible to avoid trouble, and the necessity of observing carefully before acting. These lessons, intended to help their son navigate life as a working-class immigrant, would serve him in ways they never imagined. Roberto often told young Luis, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Better to be the nail nobody notices." Esperanza's advice was more practical. Watch everything, say little, remember what matters. Luis internalized these teachings so completely that they became his fundamental operating principles. He learned to notice details others missed, to identify patterns that revealed hidden information, and to move through spaces without attracting attention. What his parents intended as survival skills for a marginalized community, Luis developed into something approaching professional-level surveillance and security awareness. What made Luis different from his co-workers wasn't immediately apparent to casual observation. He seemed to possess an unusual awareness of his surroundings, noting patterns that others missed entirely. He knew which security guards took extended smoke breaks and exactly when those breaks occurred. He understood which cameras had blind spots created by structural supports or maintenance equipment. He had memorized which doors were left unlocked during shift changes and which areas remained unmonitored during certain hours. This wasn't paranoia or criminal intent. It was simply the hypervigilance of a man who had spent years moving through secure spaces without being noticed. Luis approached his environment like a naturalist studying an ecosystem, cataloging behaviors, identifying relationships, and understanding the complex web of human and technological systems that maintained airport security. He was like a ghost who studied the living, Agent Santos would later observe during case briefings. 11 years of watching, learning, memorizing, building a mental map of every weakness, every routine, every opportunity. Most people go through life on autopilot, but Luis was always conscious, always analyzing. That kind of sustained observation eventually reveals patterns that others never see. The criminal justice professors who would later analyze Luis's case identified him as an example of what they termed accidental criminal genius, someone whose natural abilities and circumstances aligned to create extraordinary criminal potential without conscious intent to develop such capabilities. Luis hadn't set out to become a master thief any more than a talented musician sets out to become a virtuoso. But years of unconscious preparation had created the perfect skill set for executing complex criminal enterprises. July 12, 2021, began like any other night for Luis Ortega. He clocked in at 11:47 p.m., collected his cleaning supplies from the storage room shared by all maintenance contractors, and began his assigned route through Terminal 4's international arrivals area. The late shift brought its own rhythm. Less chaos than daytime operations, more time to work methodically, occasional interesting conversations with security guards killing time until dawn. The overnight crew at JFK formed its own micro-society, a collection of night owls, insomniacs, and working-class people who had chosen unconventional schedules for various reasons. Luis knew them all. Janet Morrison, the TSA supervisor who was putting her daughter through nursing school. Carlos Rivera, the customs agent studying law through correspondence courses. Michelle Chen, the air traffic coordinator who preferred nights because they paid better and allowed her to pursue photography during daylight hours. What Luis didn't know was that Flight 247 from Bogota had just delivered more than passengers and legitimate cargo. Hidden among the standard diplomatic pouches and declared shipments was a steel-lined container marked with the innocuous label, "Medical Equipment, Urgent Humanitarian Aid." The paperwork listed its contents as portable dialysis machines destined for a charity in the Bronx called Hearts Across America's Foundation. The documentation looked impeccable to anyone conducting routine inspection. Official stamps from the Colombian Ministry of Health, proper manifests listing specific medical equipment with model numbers and manufacturer specifications. letters from American nonprofit organizations expressing urgent need for the supplies, even photographs of the supposed dialysis machines, complete with technical specifications and FDA approval numbers. The reality was far different, representing 3 years of careful planning and systematic corruption of legitimate humanitarian aid systems. Inside the crate, packed with surgical precision, were vacuum-sealed bricks of cash, $17 million in 20s, 50s, and hundreds. This was dirty money from the Medellin Norte cartel, profits from cocaine sales across the eastern seaboard that needed laundering through a network of fake charities, shell companies, and corrupt nonprofit organizations. Each brick contained exactly $50,000, wrapped in heavy-duty plastic and arranged to match the size and weight distribution of actual medical equipment. The operation had been running smoothly for 3 years, moving approximately $200 million through JFK without a single interdiction. Every month, sometimes twice monthly, similar crates arrived through the diplomatic cargo system. They bypassed normal customs inspections thanks to falsified humanitarian documentation and the cooperation of strategically placed airport personnel who had been either bribed or coerced into cooperation. The money would disappear into the labyrinthine American nonprofit sector, emerging clean on the other side through inflated construction contracts for non-existent clinics, padded administrative costs for fictional aid programs, and consulting fees paid to shell companies controlled by cartel financial specialists. The system was nearly foolproof because it exploited the legitimate desire to expedite humanitarian aid while hiding criminal proceeds within the massive flow of international charity work. What made this system particularly elegant was its simplicity and exploitation of human psychology. Customs agents, even suspicious ones, were reluctant to delay medical equipment destined for poor communities. The documentation was professionally prepared and emotionally compelling, featuring photographs of sick children and desperate families who would supposedly benefit from the equipment. Few inspectors wanted to be responsible for delaying life-saving medical supplies over bureaucratic concerns. The containers bore small red stickers reading "Expedited Customs, Pre-Cleared," that marked them as non-suspicious cargo requiring minimal inspection. To most airport personnel, these stickers represented routine administrative efficiency. Only a handful of people knew what those red stickers really meant. Inside job, handle with care, ask no questions, and ensure smooth transfer to designated pickup teams. The crate sat in Cargo Bay 7 throughout the day of July 12th, waiting for the designated pickup crew that would arrive after midnight to complete the final phase of the laundering operation. Security cameras monitored the area, but the angles had been carefully mapped over months of observation to create shadows where certain activities could occur unobserved. The cartel had invested substantial resources in understanding JFK's security systems, bribing key personnel, and developing procedures that minimize risk while maximizing efficiency. But systems, no matter how well designed, have one critical vulnerability. They require human operators. And humans, as Luis Ortega was about to demonstrate, can be unpredictable in ways that no amount of planning can anticipate. As he pushed his mop bucket past Cargo Bay 7 that night, Luis had no idea he was walking past enough money to change his life forever. The crate looked identical to dozens of others, just another container in America's endless stream of international commerce. But fate, as they say, favors the prepared mind. And Luis Ortega had been preparing, whether he knew it or not, for over a decade. The first crack in the cartel's system appeared at 2:33 a.m. on July 15th, 3 days after the latest money shipment had arrived at JFK. Luis was working his usual route when he heard raised voices echoing from the restricted tarmac corridor, an area normally quiet as a tomb during the overnight hours. The sound was unusual enough to catch his attention immediately, breaking through the ambient noise of air conditioning systems and distant jet engines. Curiosity had always been Luis's weakness and strength simultaneously. While other janitors avoided restricted areas to prevent complications with supervisors or security personnel, Luis had learned that his uniform and cleaning cart granted him access to almost anywhere within the airport complex. Security guards barely glanced at him. He was part of the airport's background infrastructure, like the hum of ventilation systems or the distant roar of departing aircraft. He pushed his cart closer to investigate the commotion, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in the area. Through the reinforced glass doors leading to the cargo processing area, he could see a man in an Atlantic Security Services contractor's uniform, someone Luis didn't recognize from the regular night shift rotation. The man was pacing back and forth while speaking animatedly into his phone, his body language suggesting a combination of anger, frustration, and what looked like genuine fear. "I don't care what Ramirez says," the security contractor was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the empty corridor, despite his apparent attempts to speak quietly. "The schedule is completely fucked. We can't move it until Friday at the earliest. Maybe not until next week. The customs guy is asking too many questions." Luis pretended to clean the same section of floor for 10 minutes, moving his mop in slow, deliberate circles, while straining to hear more of the conversation. The contractor, a tall man with a pronounced Brooklyn accent and the build of someone who had once been athletic but was now running to fat, seemed to be arguing with someone in a position of authority, possibly someone who wasn't accepting his explanations or excuses. "Look, I understand the timeline," the contractor continued, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent Luis from hearing. "But if we push too hard now, we're going to have federal agents crawling all over this place. The dog unit made an unscheduled run through the cargo area yesterday. Something has them spooked, and we need to lay low until things settle down." Then something happened that would change everything. In his agitation, the contractor gestured emphatically while pacing, causing his clipboard to slip from his hands and scatter papers across the polished floor. He cursed loudly, ended his phone call abruptly, and began collecting the documents while glancing around nervously to see if anyone had witnessed his clumsiness. Luis seized the moment with the instincts of someone who had spent decades being helpful without being noticed. Moving with practiced invisibility, he positioned himself to assist in gathering the scattered papers. Just another conscientious airport employee helping a colleague in distress. The contractor barely acknowledged him as Luis handed over several shipping manifests, customs forms, and what appeared to be internal memos with official-looking letterheads. But in those brief seconds, as Luis collected and sorted the documents, his trained memory absorbed crucial details that would remain permanently etched in his consciousness with photographic clarity. Container numbers that didn't match standard international shipping formats. Delivery routes that bypassed normal customs procedures through what appeared to be special diplomatic channels. Pickup schedules that occurred exclusively during overnight hours when minimal supervision was present. Most telling of all was a pattern of recurring shipments marked with those distinctive red, expedited clearance stickers, all arriving on predictable schedules from the same origin city, Bogota, Colombia. The paperwork revealed a sophisticated operation that had clearly been running for an extended period, with multiple participants and carefully coordinated logistics. "Thanks," the contractor mumbled, snatching the remaining papers from Luis's hands without making eye contact. "No problem," Luis replied automatically, already returning to his mop and bucket. But his mind was racing with questions and possibilities. 11 years of working nights at JFK had taught him the rhythm of legitimate operations, the normal patterns of international cargo handling, and the standard procedures for processing diplomatic shipments. What he had just witnessed felt fundamentally wrong, too secretive, too urgent, too carefully orchestrated to represent routine cargo handling. That night, instead of reading his usual crime thriller during the mandatory lunch break, Luis pulled out his worn composition notebook and wrote down everything he could remember with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire approach to work and life. Container numbers, shipping codes, the contractor's physical description, overheard phone conversation fragments, and the precise timing of everything he had observed. He didn't yet understand what he had stumbled onto, but his instincts, honed by years of reading elaborate criminal schemes and observing human behavior under stress, told him he had discovered something significant. The invisible janitor had just become an accidental investigator, though he wouldn't fully comprehend the implications for several more weeks. Over the following days, Luis found himself paying closer attention to activities around Cargo Bay 7, the area where the suspicious container had been stored. His cleaning duties provided perfect cover for extended observation, allowing him to note patterns that would be invisible to casual observers. He began to see that certain containers received different treatment: expedited processing, minimal inspection, and handling by specific personnel who didn't follow standard procedures. More importantly, Luis began to understand that his years of invisibility had provided him with something invaluable: comprehensive knowledge of airport operations that even many security professionals lacked. He knew things that supervisors and administrators didn't know because he had been present during thousands of shift changes, policy modifications, and procedural adjustments that occurred during overnight hours when most management personnel were absent. The Invisible Man had been watching and learning for over a decade. Now, for the first time in his adult life, Luis Ortega began to consider how that knowledge might be used for something more significant than maintaining spotless floors and empty wastebaskets. Over the following weeks, Luis Ortega transformed his nightly routine into a covert intelligence operation that would have impressed professional surveillance specialists. His cleaning duties provided perfect cover for systematic observation, allowing him to study cargo operations with the methodical patience of someone who had spent years developing expertise in remaining unnoticed while absorbing maximum information. He began mapping the late-night activity patterns around Cargo Bay 7 with scientific precision, documenting everything in his composition notebook using a simple code system that would look like maintenance notes to casual observers. The same group of contractors appeared every few weeks, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always handling containers marked with those distinctive red expedited clearance stickers. They worked with military-like precision, moving specific crates to unmarked panel vans that arrived through the service entrance, normally used by catering trucks and fuel suppliers. Luis's notebook grew thick with observations that revealed the sophisticated nature of whatever operation he was witnessing. He documented which security cameras had blind spots created by structural supports, lighting fixtures, or strategically placed equipment. He noted which guards took extended breaks and precisely when those breaks occurred. He identified doors that remained unlocked during shift changes and areas that went unmonitored during specific time periods. His crime novels had taught him to think simultaneously like both criminal and investigator, to see vulnerabilities while understanding the systems designed to prevent their exploitation. Books by authors like Elmore Leonard, Donald Westlake, and Richard Stark had provided Luis with a graduate-level education in criminal methodology, teaching him that successful crimes required understanding security systems better than the people operating them. The breakthrough came on August 3rd, when mechanical problems with Cargo Bay 7's hydraulic doors forced workers to leave a container partially open during loading operations. Luis happened to be cleaning nearby when a forklift operator struggled with the malfunctioning door mechanism, creating an opportunity for observation that lasted nearly 20 minutes while maintenance personnel attempted repairs. What Luis saw through that partially open container changed his understanding completely. Instead of medical equipment or legitimate diplomatic materials, he glimpsed neat stacks of vacuum-sealed packages that were obviously not humanitarian supplies. The packages were brick-shaped, wrapped in industrial-grade plastic, and arranged with the mathematical precision of currency stored in bank vaults. Even from a distance of 30 feet, Luis recognized exactly what he was looking at. More cash than he had ever seen in his life. More money than he had imagined could exist in one location. That night, Luis went home to his studio apartment and conducted research with the same methodical approach he brought to every aspect of his life. Using the public computers at the Queens Central Library, he had never owned a personal computer or smartphone, viewing such devices as potential surveillance tools. He searched for information about humanitarian aid shipments from Colombia, nonprofit organizations operating in the Bronx, and historical patterns of money laundering through fake charitable organizations. The pieces of the puzzle assembled themselves into a clear and disturbing picture. Luis had discovered a major money laundering operation, almost certainly connected to drug trafficking organizations that needed to transform cash proceeds from illegal sales into legitimate financial instruments. The monthly shipments weren't medical supplies, but dirty money being processed through the American nonprofit system, exploiting humanitarian aid protocols to bypass normal customs inspections. The red stickers weren't legitimate customs clearances, but signals to corrupt airport personnel, indicating which containers required special handling and minimal scrutiny. The operation had clearly been running for years, suggesting a level of sophistication and corruption that extended far beyond simple bribery of individual employees. Luis understood that he possessed information worth millions to law enforcement agencies, and potentially worth his life if the wrong people discovered his knowledge. Drug cartels didn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operations, and Luis had no illusions about what would happen if his surveillance activities were detected by the organization running the laundering scheme. But he also recognized something else, something that his years of reading crime fiction had prepared him to see clearly. The system was designed to be invisible and secure, but Luis had been studying invisibility his entire career. He knew the airport's rhythms better than most security professionals, understood its operational weaknesses more completely than the administrators who managed it, and had access to areas that most employees never saw. More importantly, Luis had identified the operation's critical vulnerability. It relied on routine, predictability, and the assumption that no one was paying attention. The criminals had designed their system to exploit human psychology and bureaucratic inertia. But they hadn't anticipated someone like Luis, a person with both the access and the intelligence to understand what was happening, combined with the patience to study their methods over an extended period. For the first time in his adult life, Luis Ortega began to plan for a future that extended beyond mopping floors and living paycheck to paycheck. He began to plan what crime writers would recognize as the perfect heist, not because it was technically complex, but because it exploited the fundamental assumptions that made the target vulnerable. Luis spent the next several weeks developing what he privately called the inventory, a comprehensive catalog of everything he had observed about the money laundering operation. Container arrival schedules, pickup procedures, personnel involved, security vulnerabilities, and most importantly, the precise location where millions of dollars in cartel cash sat unguarded for days at a time. He also began what he thought of as scenario planning, working through different approaches to what he was increasingly certain was the opportunity of several lifetimes. Luis approached this planning with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized every aspect of his work, considering not just the mechanics of acquiring the money, but the equally important challenges of avoiding detection and disappearing successfully. The crime novels had taught him that most criminals failed not because their plans were technically flawed, but because they didn't think far enough ahead. They focused on acquiring money or goods but neglected the complexities of avoiding capture, managing stolen assets, or creating new identities that would withstand scrutiny. Luis was determined not to make those mistakes. Planning the theft took Luis Ortega 6 weeks of meticulous preparation that demonstrated the same attention to detail he had brought to 11 years of custodial work. Unlike the impulsive criminals featured in many of his paperback novels, Luis approached the job with the patience and systematic thinking of someone who understood that success lay in comprehensive preparation rather than dramatic execution. The first challenge was timing. The containers arrived monthly, always on the second Tuesday, always on Flight 247 from Bogota. Through careful observation, Luis had established that they remained in Cargo Bay 7 for exactly 11 days before the designated pickup crew arrived to transfer them to their final destination. This window provided his opportunity, but only if he could execute the theft without triggering any of the sophisticated security systems designed to protect the airport's most sensitive areas. The second challenge was logistics. Moving a 400-pound container filled with cash required mechanical assistance and a plausible cover story that would withstand scrutiny from security personnel who might question unusual activity. Luis solved this problem by studying the airport's maintenance operations over several months, discovering that malfunctioning containers were routinely transferred to Hangar 12 for detailed inspection and repair work. Better yet, these transfers often occurred during night shifts when minimal supervision was available, and fewer questions were asked about routine maintenance activities. The breakthrough in his planning came when Luis realized he didn't need to steal the container in any conventional sense. He needed to replace it with an identical container that would pass casual inspection. Hangar 12 contained dozens of empty containers awaiting repair, disposal, or return to shipping companies. If he could swap an empty container for the money-filled one, the theft might go undetected until the pickup crew arrived days later and discovered their cash had vanished. This approach offered several critical advantages. First, it would delay discovery of the theft, providing Luis with additional time to execute his escape plan. Second, it would confuse the initial investigation by making the theft appear more sophisticated than a simple grab-and-run operation. Third, it would focus suspicion on airport personnel with access to cargo handling equipment rather than cleaning staff who weren't supposed to have such access. Luis spent 2 weeks studying container movement procedures, learning which personnel had access to hydraulic equipment and how transfers were documented in the airport's logistics system. He discovered that routine maintenance transfers were often logged hours after they occurred, creating windows of opportunity for unauthorized movement that wouldn't be detected immediately. On September 14th, Luis put his plan into motion, beginning with what he privately termed credential acquisition. He had been observing Tommy Chen, a fellow janitor who worked a different area of the airport, for several months. Tommy was reliable but not particularly observant, and Luis had noted that he occasionally left his ID badge in his locker when taking extended bathroom breaks or grabbing food from the employee cafeteria. When Tommy called in sick with what he described as severe food poisoning, an illness that would likely keep him away from work for several days, Luis saw his opportunity. During a carefully planned coincidental visit to the employee break room, Luis borrowed Tommy's ID badge, knowing that his own access credentials wouldn't provide entry to the restricted cargo areas where the container switch would need to occur. The critical phase began at 2:15 a.m., when Luis made his move with the confidence and purposeful demeanor of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Using an industrial dolly borrowed from the maintenance department, a piece of equipment that cleaning staff occasionally used for moving large supplies, he approached Cargo Bay 7 with the practiced invisibility that had served him throughout his career. His navy blue uniform and purposeful movements rendered him effectively invisible to the few security guards on duty. Airport security personnel had grown accustomed to seeing maintenance workers moving equipment during overnight hours, and Luis's calm demeanor suggested routine operations rather than criminal activity. He had learned that confident behavior and proper identification could overcome most casual scrutiny. The critical moment came when Luis needed to temporarily obscure the nearest security camera to prevent documentation of his activities. Through months of observation, he had discovered that the industrial floor buffer machines produced a cleaning steam that temporarily fogged camera lenses, a side effect that maintenance crews routinely dealt with but rarely reported to security personnel because it was considered a minor technical issue. By positioning a floor buffer strategically and creating a brief mechanical malfunction that increased steam production, Luis generated a 5-minute window of visual obstruction that would appear accidental to anyone reviewing security footage. The timing had to be perfect, and Luis had practiced the procedure multiple times to ensure he could execute it smoothly under pressure. Working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved heavy equipment thousands of times during his career, Luis loaded the money-filled container onto his dolly and began the carefully planned route through service corridors to Hangar 12. The journey required him to pass through 2 security checkpoints, but Tommy's borrowed ID badge and Luis's confident presentation allowed him to proceed without questions or delays. To any observer, and there were few during the overnight hours, he appeared to be simply another maintenance worker transferring defective cargo for inspection, a routine operation that occurred multiple times each week. Luis had studied the routes extensively, choosing paths that minimized exposure to security cameras, while avoiding areas where his presence might seem unusual or suspicious. The return trip with an empty replacement container took 7 minutes and required even more precision. Luis selected a container that matched the original in size, shape, and exterior markings, ensuring that casual inspection would reveal nothing suspicious. He positioned it exactly where the money-filled container had been stored, paying careful attention to orientation and proximity to other cargo that might be affected by the switch. The weight difference between full and empty containers might eventually raise questions during routine handling, but Luis calculated that any such concerns would arise only after the scheduled pickup crew arrived to collect what they believed was their money. By then, Luis planned to be far from New York and completely untraceable through any conventional investigative methods. The entire operation consumed 13 minutes and 47 seconds, timed precisely by Luis using a digital watch he had purchased specifically for the operation. He returned the borrowed dolly to its proper location, restored the floor buffer to normal operation, and resumed his regular cleaning routine without any apparent deviation from his normal schedule or demeanor. By 3 a.m., Luis was mopping floors in Terminal 2, having committed what would later be described by federal investigators as one of the most audacious and perfectly executed thefts in American criminal history. The $17 million container now sat in Hangar 12. effectively hidden among dozens of other shipping containers awaiting routine maintenance, while an empty decoy occupied its place in the cartel's money laundering pipeline. But the theft itself was only the beginning of Luis's plan. The real challenge lay ahead, extracting the money from the airport, converting it into manageable form, and disappearing completely before anyone realized what had happened. Luis had arranged for a rental van to be waiting at the service entrance, registered under a false identity created through identity theft techniques he had learned from his extensive reading about criminal enterprises. Loading the container would take place during the following night's shift, when even fewer personnel would be present to witness the final phase of his operation. But as Luis pushed his mop through the empty terminal corridors, maintaining the same routine that had defined his life for over a decade, he had no way of knowing that his perfect crime was about to make him the target of both federal investigators and one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in South America. The money was his, but the real test was just beginning. For 6 days after the theft, Luis Ortega maintained his normal routine with the discipline and attention to detail of a method actor preparing for the most important performance of his life. He arrived for work precisely on time, cleaned his assigned areas with typical efficiency, engaged in casual small talk with colleagues about mundane topics, upcoming overtime opportunities, complaints about airport management, speculation about whether the employee cafeteria would ever improve its coffee. Only Luis knew that a rented van parked in a Queens storage facility now contained enough money to transform his existence completely. He had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility. Now that same invisibility would become his greatest weapon for vanishing entirely from the traceable world. The 6 days between theft and discovery were carefully choreographed to establish what criminal investigators call behavioral baseline, maintaining such consistent patterns that his eventual disappearance would seem sudden and inexplicable rather than the result of long-term planning. Luis understood that any deviation from his established routine might later be identified as evidence of premeditation, so he continued living exactly as he had for years, while internally preparing for the most dramatic change imaginable. On September 20th, the pickup crew arrived at JFK expecting to collect their monthly delivery of laundered cartel money. Luis watched from a distance as 3 men in contractors' uniforms approached Cargo Bay 7.